Joining us for more analysis is Ukrainian MP Oleksiy Goncharenko. Thank you for joining us today.
Hello.
Oleksiy, Russia just launched its largest aerial attack of the year during these talks, actually, leaving thousands of Ukrainians without electricity or heating. So how do we interpret this contradiction here? And what message are the Russians sending to Ukraine and its allies?
It's not thousands, it's millions of Ukrainians who are now without electricity, without heating, and it is -20 in parts of Ukraine, or -10 in other parts of Ukraine, but it's very, very cold, and it's real humanitarian catastrophe which is happening today in Ukraine. And Russia makes this catastrophe absolutely consciously. And yes, all of this happens just in the middle of so-called negotiations. What is the message? The message is that Russia doesn't want peace. This is a real message. We want peace as soon as possible, so we continue these negotiations, but from Russian side, there is no goodwill at all.
And from a Ukrainian perspective here, President Zelensky, also Russia, called the talks constructive. So in diplomatic terms, what does this actually signal, and what does constructive mean for Ukraine?
I think Ukrainian president wants to show that we are ready to continue. That's why he speaks about constructiveness, because for the moment there is no result. But the fact that we are speaking is better than when it was before, when nobody spoke to anybody. So from this point of view, I welcome to the fact that the negotiations are happening, but I don't see results now, and I don't believe in some quick results.
How much, at this point, after nearly 4 years of a full-scale war and invasion of Ukraine, how much flexibility does Ukraine realistically have right now?
First, I would remind you that it is 4 years of full-scale invasion, but 12 years of the war. What flexibility does Ukraine have? We want peace, but we are not going to surrender. We are not going to become a vassal state of Russia. We are not going to reject our European path. So that is our flexibility. So we need to become part of European Union. We need security guarantees. We need an army which can protect Ukraine from any further attacks. And we recognize the fact that we can't kick off Russians from our occupied territories today. So they will remain illegally occupied by Russia after the end of hostilities. But for us, it is important to have these territories in this status as illegally occupied, because this is Ukrainian territories, and sooner or later, we are sure that we will take back control over them. But not by military force, but by diplomacy, politics, or maybe when the Russian Empire will fall apart, which had happened with them already several times during the last 100 years.
And during these talks, throughout the talks, and what we're going to be looking into, the main sticking point here has been territorial concessions coming from Ukraine. So how much of territorial integrity is Ukraine actually willing to sacrifice here? Because the lingering sticking point is actually specifically here, we're talking about the Donbass.
We are ready to recognize the fact, as I told you, this is a reality, that we can't kick off Russians from our territories today. And we are ready to end the war having part of our territories occupied. First, it happened in 2014. Now, part of other territories are occupied. This is Ukrainian territory according to international law and internationally recognized, but under control of Russia. So that's the solution which we are ready for the moment. Russia pushes forward unrealistic demands, like demanding from Ukraine to leave more territories and things like this, because they understand that this is a red line for us. And because and by these, they want to justify continuation of the war from their side.
And what concessions, if any, and from your perspective and from what you know, is Moscow prepared to consider here? What is Kyiv asking from Moscow?
We asked to end the war, and that's what we need. And Russia demands some new territories, some limitations of our sovereignty, and so on. We are not ready for all of this, and I think they also understand this. In general, Russia failed to achieve their goals because their goal was not to take control over part of Ukrainian territories during this war. Their goal was to wipe off Ukraine from the map of the world. They failed. Their goal was to take major centers like Kiev, Odessa, Kharkiv. They failed. So they don't want to recognize that their ultimate goal failed, and that's the problem.
And is Moscow negotiating in good faith here, on your opinion, or using talks to buy time?
Russia, definitely, they're just using talks to buy time. They are playing games with Americans. They don't have goodwill, as I already told you. But they are afraid of United States. That's why they try to show some kind of goodwill, and they can't ignore the push from the United States towards peace. But they're doing everything possible to move on this track with a teaspoon move.
And you're mentioning the United States here. Steve Witkoff, actually the U.S. Special Envoy, has faced lots of criticism for appearing to be significantly in favor of Russian interests or the Russian narrative. So are you concerned that perhaps the U.S. is listening to Russia too much when it comes to these peace negotiations?
I'm not concerned that the United States are listening to Russia too much. I'm concerned that United States are not making enough bold steps and not putting enough pressure on Russia, because Russia understands only one language of force. And each time when United States and Trump administration, President Trump, acts boldly, like seizing Russian tankers for Shadow Fleet, imposing new sanctions against Russia, speaking about delivery of Tomahawks missiles to Ukraine, every time Russia is backing. Every time Russia is coming back to the negotiation table, Russia tries to show some willingness to end the war. But each time the United States stops to put pressure on Russia, they just stops to move towards peace. So that's what I'm concerned about, that I think we could already quite long ago could finish this war, but it's not enough pressure on Russia from the US side, and that's why the war continues.
And President Zelensky just said that the U.S. guarantees document is 100% ready now. So are you optimistic about this document? And do you think that the security guarantees for Ukraine are being respected here and moving forward?
I haven't seen this document, so I can't comment it. If this document is ready and if this is the real guarantees which will be ratified by U.S. Congress, then I only can welcome it with all my heart. That's what we need.
Exactly. And what would Russia, for example, need to see here to seriously commit to a deal when it comes to Ukraine?
Russia needs just to end the war. Between now and ending of the war, just one side is standing, it's Russia. Ukraine is ready for ceasefire from March of last year. So we agreed to that time, and Russia did not. And the war continues, and people continue to die, and people continue to suffer, and without any really big results, because during last year, Russian gains on the ground are very, very tiny, absolutely not significant. We're speaking about several absolutely ruined small towns, which they captured. It's even slower than during the First World War. But people continue to die, people continue to suffer, only because Russia is not ready to accept this fact that they just can't achieve their goals.
That was Ukrainian MP Oleksiy Goncharenko. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
For more on this, I'm joined by Donald Jensen, Russian foreign policy expert at Johns Hopkins University and former diplomat at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
We're going to start with this first question, Mr. Jensen. So the first trilateral peace talks, as you know, between Russia, Ukraine, and the U.S. have now ended in Abu Dhabi with no apparent breakthrough. The talks were described as constructive by the Kremlin, but were acknowledged as still requiring substantial work ahead, and set to resume again soon in Abu Dhabi on February 1st. So how would you summarize the main outcomes from these talks that took place over the weekend?
Well, I would summarize them just as you did. There's a lot of work to do, and all three sides are talking about progress, especially the Ukrainian and U.S. sides, the Russia less so. But frankly, I don't see much progress on one key issue, which is the land territorial swap issue, if there is to be any. And second, no one has seen any details about the security guarantees which Zelensky and the American side reportedly agreed on yesterday. And those will be critical for the framework for peace if it ever comes about. On the land swap, there's frankly no sign at all that the Russians have modified their position, which is they want the entirety of Donbass and the area where the front line is, including the area which they have not yet captured. Russia has a lot of military problems. Essentially, they're demanding, and I do say demanding, they're demanding land they have not even captured in 3 years. So Zelensky has to walk very carefully. He says their progress, but frankly, I'd like to see the details.
That's right. We need some more details on that because apparently no major breakthroughs were actually achieved. So what are the major sticking points? As we know, and you mentioned, there's those points concerning territorial issues like the Donbass. Is there anything else we're missing here?
Yeah, well, there are two big issues and then some related smaller issues. Number one is the land issue. Will Ukraine give up land to the Russians to get a peace deal? So far, the answer is no. There are some conditions they might agree to, such as temporary demilitarization or something like that. That's the major issue. The second one is the issue of what will a security assurance or guarantee look like in practice. You know, I have done this myself in my diplomatic work, and it's one thing to talk about a guarantee. It's another thing to have somebody, meaning European troops, no doubtedly, with boots on the ground, very vulnerable to Russian pressure and attack. We don't know anything about this, and these are not 10% of the agenda left. These are, frankly, more than 50% of the agenda left if we rank by importance. There are other issues as well. For example, who controls the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, which is one of the largest or the largest in Europe? There are issues like that. And then the big question, of course, is who rebuilds Ukraine? And Putin has been playing some diplomatic games in the past few days, talking about frozen Russian assets and all that kind of thing. But we go back again to the framework of a deal, which must include a settlement on the land differences and a security force somehow to ensure a ceasefire. Because the Ukrainians know, as do most of us, certainly in Europe, that the Russians are likely to break a ceasefire if there's not a deterrent force right outside their troops. And that's really the central problem right now.
And from Kyiv's point of view, what's the minimal level of security guarantees that would actually be acceptable? And what would actually be a deal breaker here? Do you think these issues of security guarantees for Ukraine are actually being addressed here?
Well, my reading, excellent question. My reading is that the public opinion in Ukraine is divided. Zelensky is trying to move toward a deal, trying to keep the Americans on board his diplomacy. At the same time, a lot of Ukrainians feel that without a strong armed Ukraine, and I mean a strong armed by Ukraine's own production and deployment of weapons, there will not be a durable peace, and thus they are likely to be very skeptical of any security guarantee that does not include the arming of Ukraine. This brings us to the United States, which is whose bill of agreement is not yet clear either. Certainly the United States, I think, would be willing to monitor a ceasefire. Certainly the United States would be willing to provide intelligence. But let's say there is a force on the ground between the two sides and the Russians attack, and the United States or somebody says, well, the Russians are at fault. Then what? Who's going to push Putin back? And that's what Ukrainians are concerned about. They frankly have had their fill, as we say, of diplomatic guarantees going back to Budapest in 1994. So this has to be done very carefully, as we say. Excuse me. Zelensky's trying to thread the needle between getting an agreement, which he wants, but also protecting Ukraine's security and keeping his political standing high at home. It's not clear that he can do this, and we'll have to see.
And President Zelensky also just recently said that the U.S. security guarantees document is 100% ready. So what do you believe are the core components of this U.S. security guarantees document? And is Washington actually acting alone here? Where do we leave, for example, Europe or NATO?
I would say, of course, above all, there's diplomatic promises, which may be good and may be enforceable. Number two, the U.S. will, I think, however it's expressed on paper, continue to share intelligence with Ukraine, perhaps with its European partners. It will probably also continue the current method of selling high-tech weaponry to NATO, which in turn sells it to Ukraine. That's probably the core. Will that be enough? I don't think so right now. We have to watch, excuse me, as always, to see if the Europeans stand up. And the Europeans have been relatively active, certainly diplomatically. They voted to end Russian energy imports at the end of the year, just today. But again, when it comes to putting a multinational military force on the ground, which frankly this will require, I don't see enough progress so far. I hope there will be progress. We'll just have to see, and I'm very pleased that, as you said in your introduction, there will be another meeting, I hope, next weekend in your country to iron out some of these very, very serious differences.
Exactly. And NATO has also come up with a security guarantee framework with European leaders and the U.S. So how might this U.S. securities guarantees document that we were just talking about differ from NATO's Article 5?
Well, that's a very interesting question you ask. I don't see any sign the key NATO supporters of Ukraine will come to an agreement, first of all, about putting troops on the ground, as I said. Now, Ukraine wants, you might want to call it Article 5 light, or Ukraine wants some promise that might resemble Article 5, which would guarantee Ukraine's security in some vague way. I think we probably need more than that, as I said. I think the Russians will, using their very capable hybrid warfare methods and very powerful propaganda narratives, they will try to undermine that. And above all, they will try to undermine NATO unity. And they've, to some extent, succeeded in that so far. You see Hungary, Slovakia, and certain other members either opposed to security guarantees or wanting to keep them very restricted. So NATO has a big challenge ahead of it. And frankly, European security and the future of the NATO alliance is at stake here as well. I think the U.S. administration wants to see NATO do more. Some of them are spending more. But in terms of actual taking a risk, then I think the U.S. wants to see that as well. I believe Ukrainians want to see that as well. But again, as we say here in the United States, where's the beef? We haven't yet to see the beef. We've so far just seen the atmospherics.
And let's talk a bit about what's going out in the ground, because fighting, as we've seen on reports, on headlines, is still raging in Ukraine, including this vast attack on Ukraine's energy system that's left thousands of Ukrainians without heating right now. So given the ongoing military attacks, how do you actually reconcile these diplomatic talks with the realities on the ground?
No, they can be reconciled. First of all, the military front is more or less stopped. You see a lot of Russian propaganda about their military successes on the ground. But if you go on the line on the front, north to south, you see the Russians are making very, very little gains militarily. And moreover, the Russians are suffering about 1,000 casualties a day. And I think Western military experts agree that Russia cannot expand its front or expand its effort without more bodies. And that's a key challenge for Putin, in addition to his faltering economy. And you ask about the attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, and that's exactly the point. You're making an excellent point. Putin is hitting Ukraine civilian targets to make up for the lack of military progress on the front. And frankly, I expect he will continue to do that for another couple of months as this very tough, brutal, cold winter continues. So they're interlinked, as you said, but the attacks on civilians reflect Russia's inability to move militarily in Donbass. And that's a key problem for Putin, because the little signs we see about Russia's support or not at home for the war all suggest the Russians themselves are less likely to support the war than they were even 6 months ago. They support it, but not with as much enthusiasm. And second, Putin has a parliamentary election coming up late summer, early fall. That also requires a selling to the Russian public, even though these elections are rigged, but a selling of the Russian public that the war or something is going on in a positive direction. That's a key political challenge for Putin, and I don't think he's come up with an answer yet.
And how likely is it that next week's scheduled continuation of talks could actually produce a breakthrough here? Should we be, or can we be optimistic, considering that they said talks were constructive, or should we practice some caution here once again?
I think, ma'am, you're doing the right question. Yeah, don't be optimistic. Deal with facts on the ground. And the facts on the ground are there's no agreement on the issues that I said. And we want to see much more detail about the security or reassurance promises from the West. Until we see the details of those, we cannot be particularly optimistic, but we can be hopeful. And I repeat what I said earlier, which is the Russian propaganda arm from Putin on down has increasingly rejected anything short of a Russian victory in Ukraine. Even in the past 2 or 3 days, overnight they're talking about using chemical weapons, that kind of thing. This is to break the alliance behind Ukraine. This is to intimidate the West, and we have to deal with cold, hard facts on the ground. And that is to say that Ukraine needs the not just guarantees, but the assurances, the troops on the ground to make sure that it can stop Russian aggression. And Putin will seriously go to the bargaining table. Unfortunately, he's not there yet.
Donald Jensen, thank you so much for joining us from Washington. Your analysis is greatly appreciated today on the program.
Thank you.